The Love of Long Ago by Guy de Maupassant. The old-fashioned chateau was built on a wooded knoll in the midst of tall trees with dark green foliage. The park extended to a great distance, in one direction to the edge of the forest, in another to the distant country. A few yards from the front of the house was a huge stone basin with marble ladies taking a bath. Other basins were seen at intervals down to the foot of the slope, and a stream of water fell in cascades from one basin to another, from the manor house, which preserved the grace of a superannuated coquette, down to the grottos encrusted with shellwork, where slumbered the loves of a bygone age. Everything in this antique domain had retained the physiognomy of former days. Everything seemed to speak still of ancient customs, of the manners of long ago, of former gallantries, and of the elegant trivialities so dear to our grandmothers. In a parlour in the style of Louis XV, whose walls were covered with shepherds paying court to shepherdesses, beautiful ladies in hoop-skirts, and gallant gentlemen in wigs, a very old woman, who seemed dead as soon as she ceased to move, was almost lying down in a large easy-chair, at each side of which hung a thin, mummy-like hand. Her dim eyes were gazing dreamily toward the distant horizon, as if they sought to follow through the park the visions of her youth. Through the open window every now and then came a breath of air laden with the odour of grass and the perfume of flowers. It made her white locks flutter around her wrinkled forehead, and old memories float through her brain. Beside her, on a tapestried stool, a young girl with long fair hair hanging in braids down her back was embroidering an altar cloth. There was a pensive expression in her eyes, and it was easy to see that she was dreaming while her agile fingers flew over her work. But the old lady turned round her head and said, "Bertha, read me something out of the newspapers, that I may still know sometimes what is going on in the world." The young girl took up a newspaper and cast a rapid glance over it. "There is a great deal about politics, Grandmamma. Shall I pass that over?" "Yes, yes, darling. Are there no love stories? Is gallantry, then, dead in France, that they no longer talk about abductions or adventures as they did formerly?" The girl made a long search through the columns of the newspaper. "Here is one," she said. "It is entitled, 'A Love Drama.'" The old woman smiled through her wrinkles. "Read that for me," she said, and Bertha commenced. It was a case of vitriol throwing. A wife, in order to avenge herself on her husband's mistress, had burned her face and eyes. She had left the court of assizes acquitted, declared to be innocent amid the applause of the crowd. The grandmother moved about excitedly in her chair and exclaimed, "This is horrible. Why, it is perfectly horrible. See whether you can find anything else to read to me, darling." Bertha again made a search, and farther down among the reports of criminal cases she read, "Gloomy drama. A shop girl, no longer young, allowed herself to be led astray by a young man. Then, to avenge herself on her lover, whose heart proved fickle, she shot him with a revolver. The unhappy man is maimed for life. The jury, all men of moral character, condoning the illicit love of the murderess, honourably acquitted her." This time, the old grandmother appeared quite shocked, and in a trembling voice she said, "Why, you people are mad nowadays. You are mad. The good God has given you love, the only enchantment in life. Man has added to this gallantry the only distraction of our dull hours, and here you are mixing up with it vitriol and revolvers, as if one were to put mud into a flagon of Spanish wine." Bertha did not seem to understand her grandmother's indignation. "But, Grandmamma, this woman avenged herself. Remember, she was married, and her husband deceived her." The grandmother gave a start. "What ideas have they been filling your head with, you young girls of today?" Bertha replied, "But marriage is sacred, Grandmamma." The grandmother's heart, which had its birth in the great age of gallantry, gave a sudden leap. "It is love that is sacred," she said. "Listen, child, to an old woman who has seen 3 generations, and who has had a long, long experience of men and women. Marriage and love have nothing in common. We marry to found a family, and we form families in order to constitute society. Society cannot dispense with marriage. If society is a chain, each family is a link in that chain. In order to weld those links, we always seek metals of the same order. When we marry, we must bring together suitable conditions. We must combine fortunes, unite similar races, and aim at the common interest, which is riches and children. We marry only once, my child, because the world requires us to do so, but we may love 20 times in one lifetime because nature has made us like this. Marriage, you see, is law, and love is an instinct which impels us, sometimes along a straight and sometimes along a devious path. The world has made laws to combat our instincts. It was necessary to make them, but our instincts are always stronger, and we ought not to resist them too much, because they come from God, while the laws only come from men. If we did not perfume life with love, as much love as possible, darling, as we put sugar into drugs for children, nobody would care to take it just as it is. Berta opened her eyes wide in astonishment. She murmured, "Oh, Grandmamma, we can only love once." The grandmother raised her trembling hands toward heaven, as if again to invoke the defunct god of gallantries. She exclaimed indignantly, "You have become a race of serfs, a race of common people. Since the revolution, it is impossible any longer to recognize society. You have attached big words to every action and wearisome duties to every corner of existence. You believe in equality and eternal passion. People have written poetry telling you that people have died of love. In my time, poetry was written to teach men to love every woman. And when we liked a gentleman, my child, we sent him a page. And when a fresh caprice came into our hearts, we were not slow in getting rid of the last lover, unless we kept both of them." The old woman smiled a keen smile, and a gleam of roguery twinkled in her grey eye, the intellectual, skeptical roguery of those people who did not believe that they were made of the same clay as the rest, and who lived as masters for whom common beliefs were not intended. The young girl, turning very pale, faltered out, "So then, women have no honor?" The grandmother ceased to smile. If she had kept in her soul some of Voltaire's irony, she had also a little of Jean-Jacques' glowing philosophy. "No honor, because we loved and dared to say so, and even boasted of it. But, my child, if one of us, among the greatest ladies in France, had lived without a lover, she would have had the entire court laughing at her. Those who wished to live differently had only to enter a convent. And you imagine, perhaps, that your husbands will love, but you alone, all their lives. As if, indeed, this could be the case. I tell you that marriage is a thing necessary in order that society should exist, but it is not in the nature of our race, do you understand? There is only one good thing in life, and that is love. And how you misunderstand it, how you spoil it. You treat it as something solemn like a sacrament, or something to be bought, like a dress." The young girl caught the old woman's trembling hands in her own. "Hold your tongue, I beg of you, Grandmamma." And on her knees, with tears in her eyes, she prayed to heaven to bestow on her a great passion, one sole, eternal passion, in accordance with the dream of modern poets, while the grandmother, kissing her on the forehead, quite imbued still with that charming, healthy reason with which gallant philosophers tinctured the thought of the 18th century, murmured, "Take care, my poor darling. If you believe in such folly as that, you will be very unhappy." Two Friends, a short story by Guy de Maupassant. Besieged Paris was in the throes of famine. Even the sparrows on the roofs and the rats in the sewers were growing scarce. People were eating anything they could get. As Monsieur Morisseau, watchmaker by profession and idler for the nonce, was strolling along the boulevard one bright January morning, his hands in his trousers pockets and stomach empty, he suddenly came face to face with an acquaintance, Monsieur Sauvage, a fishing chum. Before the war broke out, Morisot had been in the habit, every Sunday morning, of setting forth with a bamboo rod in his hand and a tin box on his back. He took the Argenteuil train, got out at Colombes, and walked thence to the Île Marante. The moment he arrived at this place of his dreams, he began fishing, and fished till nightfall. Every Sunday he met in this very spot Monsieur Sauvage, a stout, jolly little man, a draper in the Rue Notre-Dame de Lorette, and also an ardent fisherman. They often spent half the day side by side, rod in hand and feet dangling over the water, and a warm friendship had sprung up between the two. Some days they did not speak, at other times they chatted, but they understood each other perfectly without the aid of words, having similar tastes and feelings. In the spring, about 10 o'clock in the morning, when the early sun caused a light mist to float on the water and gently warmed the backs of the two enthusiastic anglers, Morisot would occasionally remark to his neighbor, "My, but it's pleasant here." To which the other would reply, "I can't imagine anything better." And these few words sufficed to make them understand and appreciate each other. In the autumn, toward the close of day, when the setting sun shed a blood-red glow over the western sky, and the reflection of the crimson clouds tinged the whole river with red, brought a glow to the faces of the two friends, and gilded the trees, whose leaves were already turning at the first chill touch of winter, Monsieur Sauvage would sometimes smile at Morisot and say, "What a glorious spectacle!" And Morisot would answer, without taking his eyes from his float, "This is much better than the boulevard, isn't it?" As soon as they recognized each other, they shook hands cordially, affected at the thought of meeting under such changed circumstances. Monsieur Sauvage, with a sigh, murmured, "These are sad times." Morisot shook his head mournfully. "And such weather! This is the first fine day of the year." The sky was, in fact, of a bright, cloudless blue. They walked along, side by side, reflective and sad. "And to think of the fishing," said Morisot. "What good times we used to have." "When shall we be able to fish again?" asked Monsieur Sauvage. They entered a small café and took an absinthe together, then resumed their walk along the pavement. Morisot stopped suddenly. "Shall we have another absinthe?" he said. "If you like," agreed Monsieur Sauvage. And they entered another wine shop. They were quite unsteady when they came out, owing to the effect of the alcohol on their empty stomachs. It was a fine, mild day, and a gentle breeze fanned their faces. The fresh air completed the effect of the alcohol on Monsieur Sauvage. He stopped suddenly, saying, "Suppose we go there." "Where?" "Fishing." "But where?" "Why, to the old place. The French outposts are close to Colombes. I know Colonel Dumoulin, and we shall easily get leave to pass." Morisot trembled with desire. "Very well, I agree." And they separated to fetch their rods and lines. An hour later, they were walking side by side on the high road. Presently, they reached the villa occupied by the colonel. He smiled at their request and granted it. They resumed their walk, furnished with a password. Soon they left the outpost behind them, made their way through deserted Colombes, and found themselves on the outskirts of the small vineyards which border the Seine. It was about 11 o'clock. Before them lay the village of Argenteuil, apparently lifeless. The heights of Orgemont and Sanois dominated the landscape. The great plain, extending as far as Nanterre, was empty, quite empty, a waste of dun-colored soil and bare cherry trees. Monsieur Sauvage, pointing to the heights, murmured, "The Prussians are up yonder." And the sight of the deserted country filled the two friends with vague misgivings. The Prussians! They had never seen them as yet, but they had felt their presence in the neighborhood of Paris for months past, ruining France, pillaging, massacring, starving them. And a kind of superstitious terror mingled with the hatred they already felt toward this unknown, victorious nation. "Suppose we were to meet any of them," said Morisot. We'd offer them some fish, replied Monsieur Sauvage, with that Parisian light-heartedness which nothing can wholly quench. Still, they hesitated to show themselves in the open country, overawed by the utter silence which reigned around them. At last, Monsieur Sauvage said boldly, "Come, we'll make a start. Only let us be careful." And they made their way through one of the vineyards, bent double, creeping along beneath the cover afforded by the vines, with eye and ear alert. A strip of bare ground remained to be crossed before they could gain the river-bank. They ran across this, and as soon as they were at the water's edge, concealed themselves among the dry reeds. Morisot placed his ear to the ground to ascertain, if possible, whether footsteps were coming their way. He heard nothing. They seemed to be utterly alone. Their confidence was restored, and they began to fish. Before them, the deserted Ile Marante hid them from the farther shore. The little restaurant was closed and looked as if it had been deserted for years. Monsieur Sauvage caught the first gudgeon, Monsieur Morisot the second, and almost every moment one or other raised his line with a little glittering, silvery fish wriggling at the end. They were having excellent sport. They slipped their catch gently into a close-meshed bag lying at their feet. They were filled with joy, the joy of once more indulging in a pastime of which they had long been deprived. The sun poured its rays on their backs. They no longer heard anything or thought of anything. They ignored the rest of the world. They were fishing. But suddenly, a rumbling sound, which seemed to come from the bowels of the earth, shook the ground beneath them. The cannon were resuming their thunder. Morisot turned his head and could see toward the left, beyond the banks of the river, the formidable outline of Mont Valérien, from whose summit arose a white puff of smoke. The next instant, a second puff followed the first, and in a few moments a fresh detonation made the earth tremble. Others followed, and minute by minute the mountain gave forth its deadly breath and a white puff of smoke, which rose slowly into the peaceful heaven and floated above the summit of the cliff. Monsieur Sauvage shrugged his shoulders. "They are at it again," he said. Morisot, who was anxiously watching his float bobbing up and down, was suddenly seized with the angry impatience of a peaceful man toward the madmen who were firing thus, and remarked indignantly, "What fools they are to kill one another like that!" "They're worse than animals," replied Monsieur Sauvage. And Morisot, who had just caught a bleak, declared, "And to think that it will be just the same so long as there are governments." "The Republic would not have declared war," interposed Monsieur Sauvage. Morisot interrupted him. "Under a king we have foreign wars. Under a republic we have civil war." And the two began placidly discussing political problems with the sound common sense of peaceful, matter-of-fact citizens, agreeing on one point, that they would never be free. And Mont Valérien thundered ceaselessly, demolishing the houses of the French with its cannonballs, grinding lives of men to powder, destroying many a dream, many a cherished hope, many a prospective happiness, ruthlessly causing endless woe and suffering in the hearts of wives, of daughters, of mothers in other lands. "Such is life," declared Monsieur Sauvage. "Say, rather, such is death," replied Morisot, laughing. But they suddenly trembled with alarm at the sound of footsteps behind them, and turning round, they perceived close at hand 4 tall, bearded men, dressed after the manner of livery servants and wearing flat caps on their heads. They were covering the 2 anglers with their rifles. The rods slipped from their owner's grasp and floated away down the river. In the space of a few seconds they were seized, bound, thrown into a boat, and taken across to the Ile Marante. And behind the house they had thought deserted were about a score of German soldiers. A shaggy-looking giant, who was bestriding a chair and smoking a long clay pipe, addressed them in excellent French with the words, "Well, gentlemen, have you had good luck with your fishing?" Then a soldier deposited at the officer's feet the bag full of fish, which he had taken care to bring away. The Prussian smiled. "Not bad, I see, but we have something else to talk about. Listen to me and don't be alarmed. You must know that in my eyes you are two spies sent to reconnoiter me and my movements. Naturally, I capture you and I shoot you. You pretended to be fishing, the better to disguise your real errand. You have fallen into my hands and must take the consequences. Such is war. But as you came here through the outposts, you must have a password for your return. Tell me that password, and I will let you go. The two friends, pale as death, stood silently side by side, a slight fluttering of the hands alone betraying their emotion. No one will ever know, continued the officer. You will return peacefully to your homes, and the secret will disappear with you. If you refuse, it means death, instant death. Choose. They stood motionless, and did not open their lips. The Prussian, perfectly calm, went on, with hand outstretched toward the river. Just think that in 5 minutes you will be at the bottom of that water. In 5 minutes. You have relations, I presume. Mont Valérien still thundered. The two fishermen remained silent. The German turned and gave an order in his own language. Then he moved his chair a little way off, that he might not be so near the prisoners, and a dozen men stepped forward, rifle in hand, and took up a position, 20 paces off. I give you 1 minute, said the officer. Not a second longer. Then he rose quickly, went over to the two Frenchmen, took Morisot by the arm, led him a short distance off, and said in a low voice, Quick! The password! Your friend will know nothing. I will pretend to relent. Morisot answered not a word. Then the Prussian took Monsieur Sauvage aside in like manner, and made him the same proposal. Monsieur Sauvage made no reply. Again they stood side by side. The officer issued his orders. The soldiers raised their rifles. Then by chance Morisot's eyes fell on the bag full of gudgeon lying in the grass a few feet from him. A ray of sunlight made the still quivering fish glisten like silver, and Morisot's heart sank. Despite his efforts at self-control, his eyes filled with tears. "Goodbye, Monsieur Sauvage," he faltered. "Goodbye, Monsieur Morisot," replied Sauvage. They shook hands, trembling from head to foot with a dread beyond their mastery. The officer cried, "Fire!" The 12 shots were as one. Monsieur Sauvage fell forward instantaneously. Morisot, being the taller, swayed slightly and fell across his friend with face turned skyward and blood oozing from a rent in the breast of his coat. The German issued fresh orders. His men dispersed and presently returned with ropes and large stones, which they attached to the feet of the two friends. Then they carried them to the river bank. Mont Valérien, its summit now enshrouded in smoke, still continued to thunder. 2 soldiers took Morisot by the head and the feet. 2 others did the same with Sauvage. The bodies, swung lustily by strong hands, were cast to a distance, and describing a curve, fell feet foremost into the stream. The water splashed high, foamed, eddied, then grew calm. Tiny waves lapped the shore. A few streaks of blood flecked the surface of the river. The officer, calm throughout, remarked with grim humor, "It's the fish's turn now." Then he retraced his way to the house. Suddenly he caught sight of the net full of gudgeons, lying forgotten in the grass. He picked it up, examined it, smiled, and called, "Wilhelm!" A white-aproned soldier responded to the summons, and the Prussian, tossing him the catch of the 2 murdered men, said, "Have these fish fried for me at once, while they are still alive. They'll make a tasty dish." Then he resumed his pipe.
The Little Cask, a short story by Guy de Maupassant. He was a tall man of 40 or thereabout, this Jules Chicot, the innkeeper of Spreville, with a red face and a round stomach, and said by those who knew him to be a smart businessman. He stopped his buggy in front of Mother Magloire's farmhouse, and, hitching the horse to the gatepost, went in at the gate. Chicot owned some land adjoining that of the old woman, which he had been coveting for a long while, and had tried in vain to buy a score of times, but she had always obstinately refused to part with it. "I was born here, and here I mean to die," was all she said. He found her peeling potatoes outside the farmhouse door. She was a woman of about 72, very thin, shriveled and wrinkled, almost dried up in fact, and much bent, but as active and untiring as a girl. Chicot patted her on the back in a friendly fashion, and then sat down by her on a stool. "Well, mother, you are always pretty well and hearty, I am glad to see." "Nothing to complain of, considering, thank you. And how are you, Monsieur Chicot?" "Oh, pretty well, thank you, except a few rheumatic pains occasionally. Otherwise I have nothing to complain of." "So much the better." And she said no more, while Chicot watched her going on with her work. Her crooked, knotted fingers, hard as a lobster's claws, seized the tubers, which were lying in a pail, as if they had been a pair of pincers, and she peeled them rapidly, cutting off long strips of skin with an old knife which she held in the other hand, throwing the potatoes into the water as they were done. 3 daring fowls jumped one after the other into her lap, seized a bit of peel, and then ran away as fast as their legs would carry them with it in their beak. Chicot seemed embarrassed, anxious, with something on the tip of his tongue which he could not say. At last he said hurriedly, "Listen, Mother Magloire. Well, what is it? You are quite sure that you do not want to sell your land?" "Certainly not. You may make up your mind to that." "What I have said, so don't refer to it again." "Very well. Only I think I know of an arrangement that might suit us both very well." "What is it?" "Just this. You shall sell it to me and keep it all the same. You don't understand. Very well. Then follow me in what I am going to say." The old woman left off peeling potatoes and looked at the innkeeper attentively from under her heavy eyebrows. And he went on, "Let me explain myself. Every month I will give you 150 francs. You understand me? Suppose, every month I will come and bring you 30 crowns, and it will not make the slightest difference in your life, not the very slightest. You will have your own home just as you have now, need not trouble yourself about me, and will owe me nothing. All you will have to do will be to take my money. Will that arrangement suit you?" He looked at her good-humouredly. One might almost have said benevolently, and the old woman returned his looks distrustfully, as if she suspected a trap, and said, "It seems all right as far as I am concerned, but it will not give you the farm." "Never mind about that," he said. "You may remain here as long as it pleases God Almighty to let you live. It will be your home. Only you will sign a deed before a lawyer making it over to me, after your death. You have no children, only nephews and nieces for whom you don't care a straw. Will that suit you? You will keep everything during your life, and I will give you the 30 crowns a month. It is pure gain as far as you are concerned." The old woman was surprised, rather uneasy, but nevertheless very much tempted to agree, and answered, "I don't say that I will not agree to it, but I must think about it. Come back in a week, and we will talk it over again, and I will then give you my definite answer." And Chicot went off as happy as a king who had conquered an empire. Mother Magloire was thoughtful and did not sleep at all that night. In fact, for 4 days she was in a fever of hesitation. She suspected that there was something underneath the offer which was not to her advantage. But then the thought of 30 crowns a month, of all those coins clinking in her apron, falling to her, as it were, from the skies, without her doing anything for it, aroused her covetousness. She went to the notary and told him about it. He advised her to accept Chicot's offer, but said she ought to ask for an annuity of 50 instead of 30, as her farm was worth 60,000 francs at the lowest calculation. "If you live for 15 years longer," he said, "even then he will only have paid 45,000 francs for it." The old woman trembled with joy at this prospect of getting 50 crowns a month, but she was still suspicious, fearing some trick, and she remained a long time with the lawyer, asking questions, without being able to make up her mind to go. At last she gave him instructions to draw up the deed and returned home with her head in a whirl, just as if she had drunk 4 jugs of new cider. When Shiko came again to receive her answer, she declared, after a lot of persuading, that she could not make up her mind to agree to his proposal, though she was all the time trembling, lest he should not consent to give the 50 crowns. But at last, when he grew urgent, she told him what she expected for her farm. He looked surprised and disappointed and refused. Then, in order to convince him, she began to talk about the probable duration of her life. "I am certainly not likely to live more than 5 or 6 years longer. I am nearly 73 and far from strong, even considering my age. The other evening I thought I was going to die and could hardly manage to crawl into bed." But Shikot was not going to be taken in. "Come, come, old lady, you are as strong as the church tower and will live till you are 100 at least. You will no doubt see me put underground first." The whole day was spent in discussing the money, and as the old woman would not give in, the innkeeper consented to give the 50 crowns, and she insisted upon having 10 crowns over and above to strike the bargain. 3 years passed, and the old dame did not seem to have grown a day older. Chicot was in despair, and it seemed to him as if he had been paying that annuity for 50 years, that he had been taken in, done, ruined. From time to time he went to see the old lady, just as one goes in July to see when the harvest is likely to begin. She always met him with a cunning look, and one might have supposed that she was congratulating herself on the trick she had played him. Seeing how well and hearty she seemed, he very soon got into his buggy again, growling to himself, "Will you never die, you old hag?" He did not know what to do, and he felt inclined to strangle her when he saw her. He hated her with a ferocious, cunning hatred, the hatred of a peasant who has been robbed, and began to cast about for some means of getting rid of her. One day he came to see her again, rubbing his hands as he did the first time he proposed the bargain, and after having chatted for a few minutes, he said, "Why do you never come and have a bit of dinner at my place when you are in Spreville? The people are talking about it and saying we are not on friendly terms, and that pains me. You know it will cost you nothing if you come, for I don't look at the price of a dinner. Come whenever you feel inclined. I shall be very glad to see you." Old Mother Magloire did not need to be asked twice, and the next day but one, as she had to go to the town in any case. It being market day, she let her man drive her to Chicot's place, where the buggy was put in the barn while she went into the house to get her dinner. The innkeeper was delighted and treated her like a lady, giving her roast fowl, black pudding, leg of mutton and bacon and cabbage. But she ate next to nothing. She had always been a small eater, and had generally lived on a little soup and a crust of bread and butter. Chicot was disappointed and pressed her to eat more, but she refused, and she would drink little and declined coffee. So he asked her, "But surely you will take a little drop of brandy or liqueur?" "Well, as to that, I don't know that I will refuse." Whereupon he shouted out, "Rosalie, bring the superfine brandy, the special, you know." The servant appeared, carrying a long bottle ornamented with a paper vine leaf, and he filled 2 liqueur glasses. "Just try that. You will find it first rate." The good woman drank it slowly in sips, so as to make the pleasure last all the longer, and when she had finished her glass, she said, "Oh, yes, that is first rate." Almost before she had said it, Chicot had poured her out another glassful. She wished to refuse, but it was too late, and she drank it very slowly, as she had done the first, and he asked her to have a third. She objected, but he persisted. "It is as mild as milk, you know. I can drink 10 or a dozen glasses without any ill effects. It goes down like sugar and does not go to the head. One would think that it evaporated on the tongue. It is the most wholesome thing you can drink." She took it, for she really enjoyed it, but she left half the glass. Then Chicot, in an excess of generosity, said, "Look here, as it is so much to your taste, I will give you a small keg of it, just to show that you and I are still excellent friends." So she took one away with her, feeling slightly overcome by the effects of what she had drunk. The next day, the innkeeper drove into her yard and took a little iron-hooped keg out of his gig. He insisted on her tasting the contents to make sure it was the same delicious article, and when they had each of them drunk 3 more glasses, He said as he was going away, "Well, you know when it is all gone, there is more left. Don't be modest, for I shall not mind. The sooner it is finished, the better pleased I shall be." 4 days later, he came again. The old woman was outside her door cutting up the bread for her soup. He went up to her and put his face close to hers so that he might smell her breath, and when he smelt the alcohol, he felt pleased. "I suppose you will give me a glass of the special," he said. And they had 3 glasses each. Soon, however, it began to be whispered abroad that Mother Magloire was in the habit of getting drunk all by herself. She was picked up in her kitchen, then in her yard, then in the roads in the neighborhood, and she was often brought home like a log. The innkeeper did not go near her any more, and when people spoke to him about her, he used to say, putting on a distressed look, "It is a great pity that she should have taken to drink at her age. But when people get old, there is no remedy. It will be the death of her in the long run." And it certainly was the death of her. She died the next winter. About Christmas time she fell down, unconscious, in the snow, and was found dead the next morning. And when Chico came in for the farm, he said it was very stupid of her. If she had not taken to drink, she would probably have lived 10 years longer.
A Dead Woman's Secret. A short story by Guy de Maupassant. 1. Kramskoy, Maria Alexandrovna, at her deathbed, 1800s. The woman had died without pain, quietly, as a woman should whose life had been blameless. Now she was resting in her bed, lying on her back, her eyes closed, her features calm, her long white hair carefully arranged as though she had done it up 10 minutes before dying. The whole pale countenance of the dead woman was so collected, so calm, so resigned, that one could feel what a sweet soul had lived in that body, what a quiet existence this old soul had led, how easy and pure the death of this parent had been. Kneeling beside the bed, her son, a magistrate with inflexible principles, and her daughter Marguerite, known as Sister Eulalie, were weeping as though their hearts would break. She had, from childhood up, armed them with a strict moral code, teaching them religion without weakness and duty without compromise. He, the man, had become a judge and handled the law as a weapon with which he smote the weak ones without pity. She, the girl, influenced by the virtue which had bathed her in this austere family, had become the bride of the church through her loathing for man. They had hardly known their father, knowing only that he had made their mother most unhappy without being told any other details. The nun was wildly kissing the dead woman's hand, an ivory hand as white as the large crucifix lying across the bed. On the other side of the long body, the other hand seemed still to be holding the sheet in the death grasp, and the sheet had preserved the little creases as a memory of those last movements which precede eternal immobility. A few light taps on the door caused the 2 sobbing heads to look up, and the priest, who had just come from dinner, returned. He was red and out of breath from his interrupted digestion, for he had made himself a strong mixture of coffee and brandy in order to combat the fatigue of the last few nights and of the wake which was beginning. He looked sad, with that assumed sadness of the priest for whom death is a breadwinner. He crossed himself and, approaching with his professional gesture, "Well, my poor children, I have come to help you pass these last sad hours." But Sister Eulalie suddenly arose. "Thank you, Father, but my brother and I prefer to remain alone with her. This is our last chance to see her, and we wish to be together, all 3 of us, as we used to be when we were small, and our poor mother." Grief and tears stopped her. She could not continue. Once more serene, the priest bowed, thinking of his bed. "As you wish, my children." He kneeled, crossed himself, prayed, arose, and went out quietly, murmuring, "She was a saint." They remained alone, the dead woman and her children. The ticking of the clock, hidden in the shadow, could be heard distinctly, and through the open window drifted in the sweet smell of hay and of woods, together with the soft moonlight. No other noise could be heard over the land except the occasional croaking of the frog or the chirping of some belated insect. An infinite peace, a divine melancholy, a silent serenity surrounded this dead woman, seemed to be breathed out from her and to appease nature itself. Then the judge, still kneeling, his head buried in the bedclothes, cried in a voice altered by grief and deadened by the sheets and blankets, "Mama, mama, mama!" And his sister, frantically striking her forehead against the woodwork, convulsed, twitching and trembling as in an epileptic fit, moaned, "Jesus, Jesus, Mama, Jesus!" And both of them, shaken by a storm of grief, gasped and choked. The crisis slowly calmed down, and they began to weep quietly, just as on the sea when a calm follows a squall. A rather long time passed, and they arose and looked at their dead. And the memories, those distant memories, yesterday so dear, today so torturing, came to their minds with all the little forgotten details, those little intimate familiar details which bring back to life the one who has left. They recalled to each other circumstances, words, smiles, intonations of the mother who was no longer to speak to them. They saw her again, happy and calm. They remembered things which she had said, and a little motion of the hand, like beating time, which she often used when emphasizing something important. And they loved her as they never had loved her before. They measured the depth of their grief, and thus they discovered how lonely they would find themselves. It was their prop, their guide, their whole youth, all the best part of their lives which was disappearing. It was their bond with life, their mother, their mamma, the connecting link with their forefathers, which they would thenceforth miss. They now became solitary, lonely beings. They could no longer look back. The nun said to her brother, "You remember how Mamma used always to read her old letters? They are all there in that drawer. Let us in turn read them. Let us live her whole life through tonight beside her." It would be like a road to the cross, like making the acquaintance of her mother, of our grandparents, whom we never knew, but whose letters are there, and of whom she so often spoke. Do you remember? Out of the drawer, they took about 10 little packages of yellow paper, tied with care and arranged one beside the other. They threw these relics on the bed and chose one of them on which the word "Father" was written. They opened and read it. It was one of those old-fashioned letters which one finds in old family desk drawers, those epistles which smell of another century. The first one started, "My dear," another one, "My beautiful little girl," others, "My dear child," or "My dear laughter." And suddenly the nun began to read aloud, to read over to the dead woman her whole history, all her tender memories. The judge, resting his elbow on the bed, was listening with his eyes fastened on his mother. The motionless body seemed happy. Sister Eulalie, interrupting herself, said suddenly, "These ought to be put in the grave with her. They ought to be used as a shroud, and she ought to be buried in it." She took another package, on which no name was written. She began to read in a firm voice. "My adored one, I love you wildly. Since yesterday I have been suffering the tortures of the damned, haunted by our memory. I feel your lips against mine, your eyes in mine, your breast against mine. I love you, I love you. You have driven me mad. My arms open, I gasp, moved by a wild desire to hold you again. My whole soul and body cries out for you, wants you. I have kept in my mouth the taste of your kisses." The judge had straightened himself up. The nun stopped reading. He snatched the letter from her and looked for the signature. There was none, but only under the words, "The man who adores you," the name Henry. Their father's name was René, therefore this was not from him. The son then quickly rummaged through the package of letters, took one out and read, "I can no longer live without your caresses." Standing erect, severe as when sitting on the bench, he looked unmoved at the dead woman. The nun, straight as a statue, tears trembling in the corners of her eyes, was watching her brother, waiting. Then he crossed the room slowly, went to the window and stood there, gazing out into the dark night. When he turned around again, Sister Eulalie, her eyes dry now, was still standing near the bed, her head bent down. He stepped forward, quickly picked up the letters, and threw them pell-mell back into the drawer. Then he closed the curtains of the bed. When daylight made the candles on the table turn pale, the son slowly left his armchair, and without looking again at the mother upon whom he had passed sentence, severing the tie that united her to son and daughter, he said slowly, "Let us now retire, sister."
Beside Schopenhauer's corpse, a short story by Guy de Maupassant. He was slowly dying, as consumptives die. I saw him each day, about 2 o'clock, sitting beneath the hotel windows on a bench in the promenade, looking out on the calm sea. He remained for some time without moving, in the heat of the sun, gazing mournfully at the Mediterranean. Every now and then he cast a glance at the lofty mountains with beclouded summits that shut in Mentone. Then, with a very slow movement, he would cross his long legs, so thin that they seemed like two bones, around which fluttered the cloth of his trousers, and he would open a book, always the same book. And then he did not stir any more, but read on with his eye and his mind. All his wasting body seemed to read, all his soul plunged, lost, disappeared in this book, up to the hour when the cool air made him cough a little. Then he got up and re-entered the hotel. He was a tall German with fair beard, who breakfasted and dined in his own room and spoke to nobody. A vague curiosity attracted me to him. One day I sat down by his side, having taken up a book, too, to keep up appearances, a volume of Musset's poems, and I began to look through Rolla. Suddenly my neighbor said to me in good French, "Do you know German, monsieur?" "Not at all, monsieur." "I am sorry for that. Since chance has thrown us side by side, I could have lent you, I could have shown you, an inestimable thing, this book which I hold in my hand." "What is it, pray?" "It is a copy of my master, Schopenhauer, annotated with his own hand. All the margins, as you may see, are covered with his handwriting." I took the book from him reverently, and I gazed at these forms incomprehensible to me, but which revealed the immortal thoughts of the greatest shatterer of dreams who had ever dwelt on earth. And Musset's verses arose in my memory. "Hast thou found out, Voltaire, that it is bliss to die, and does thy hideous smile over thy bleached bones fly?" And involuntarily I compared the childish sarcasm, the religious sarcasm of Voltaire, with the irresistible irony of the German philosopher whose influence is henceforth ineffaceable. Let us protest, and let us be angry. Let us be indignant, or let us be enthusiastic. Schopenhauer has marked humanity with the seal of his disdain and of his disenchantment. A disabused pleasure-seeker, he overthrew beliefs, hopes, poetic ideals and chimeras, destroyed the aspirations, ravaged the confidence of souls, killed love, dragged down the chivalrous worship of women. crushed the illusions of hearts, and accomplished the most gigantic task ever attempted by skepticism. He spared nothing with his mocking spirit and exhausted everything. And even today, those who execrate him seem to carry in their own souls particles of his thought. "So then, you are intimately acquainted with Schopenhauer?" I said to the German. He smiled sadly. "Up to the time of his death, monsieur." And he spoke to me about the philosopher and told me about the almost supernatural impression which this strange being made on all who came near him. He gave me an account of the interview of the old iconoclast with a French politician, a doctrinaire Republican, who wanted to get a glimpse of this man, and found him in a noisy tavern, seated in the midst of his disciples, dry, wrinkled, laughing with an unforgettable laugh, attacking and tearing to pieces ideas and beliefs with a single word, as a dog tears with one bite of his teeth the tissues with which he plays. He repeated for me the comment of this Frenchman as he went away, astonished and terrified. I thought I had spent an hour with the devil. Then he added, "He had indeed, monsieur, a frightful smile, which terrified us even after his death. I can tell you an anecdote about it that is not generally known, if it would interest you." And he began, in a languid voice, interrupted by frequent fits of coughing. Schopenhauer had just died, and it was arranged that we should watch in turn, 2 by 2, till morning. He was lying in a large apartment, very simple, vast and gloomy. 2 wax candles were burning on the stand by the bedside. It was midnight when I went on watch, together with one of our comrades. The 2 friends whom we replaced had left the apartment, and we came and sat down at the foot of the bed. The face was not changed. It was laughing. That pucker which we knew so well lingered still around the corners of the lips, and it seemed to us that he was about to open his eyes, to move and to speak. His thought, or rather his thoughts, enveloped us. We felt ourselves more than ever in the atmosphere of his genius, absorbed, possessed by him. His domination seemed to be even more sovereign now that he was dead. A feeling of mystery was blended with the power of this incomparable spirit. The bodies of these men disappear, but they themselves remain, and in the night which follows the cessation of their heart's pulsation, I assure you, monsieur, they are terrifying. And in hushed tones we talked about him, recalling to mind certain sayings, certain formulas of his, those startling maxims which are like jets of flame flung, in a few words, into the darkness of the unknown life. "It seems to me that he is going to speak," said my comrade, and we stared with uneasiness bordering on fear at the motionless face with its eternal laugh. Gradually, we began to feel ill at ease, oppressed, on the point of fainting. I faltered. "I don't know what is the matter with me, but I assure you I am not well." And at that moment we noticed that there was an unpleasant odor from the corpse. Then my comrade suggested that we should go into the adjoining room and leave the door open, and I assented to his proposal. I took one of the wax candles which burned on the stand, and I left the second behind. Then we went and sat down at the other end of the adjoining apartment in such a position that we could see the bed and the corpse clearly revealed by the light. But he still held possession of us. One would have said that his immaterial essence, liberated, free, all-powerful and dominating, was flitting around us. And sometimes, too, the dreadful odor of the decomposed body came toward us and penetrated us, sickening and indefinable. Suddenly, a shiver passed through our bones. A sound, a slight sound, came from the death chamber. Immediately we fixed our glances on him, and we saw, yes, monsieur, we saw distinctly, both of us, something white pass across the bed, fall on the carpet, and vanish under an armchair. We were on our feet before we had time to think of anything, distracted by stupefying terror, ready to run away. Then we stared at each other. We were horribly pale. Our hearts throbbed fiercely enough to have raised the clothing on our chests. I was the first to speak. "Did you see?" "Yes, I saw." "Can it be that he is not dead?" "Why, when the body is putrefying." "What are we to do?" My companion said in a hesitating tone, "We must go and look." I took our wax candle and entered first, glancing into all the dark corners in the large apartment. Nothing was moving now, and I approached the bed, but I stood transfixed with stupor and fright. Schopenhauer was no longer laughing. He was grinning in a horrible fashion, with his lips pressed together and deep hollows in his cheeks. I stammered out, "He is not dead." But the terrible odor ascended to my nose and stifled me, and I no longer moved, but kept staring fixedly at him, terrified as if in the presence of an apparition. Then my companion, having seized the other wax candle, bent forward. Next, he touched my arm without uttering a word. I followed his glance and saw on the ground, under the armchair by the side of the bed, standing out white on the dark carpet and open as if to bite, Schopenhauer's set of artificial teeth. The work of decomposition, loosening the jaws, had made it jump out of the mouth. I was really frightened that day, monsieur. And as the sun was sinking toward the glittering sea, the consumptive German rose from his seat, gave me a parting bow, and retired into the hotel.